Securing eDirectory LDAP communications. This tutorial is part 3 in a series of tutorials. It is designed to build on the 2 previous tutorials, Part 1, Basic LDAP to eDirectory User and Group Resolution, and Part 2, Basic LDAP to eDirectory User SSH Authentication. This tutorial presumes eDirectory users are resolving and authenticating on the SLES server using LDAP on port 389. In the previous tutorials, PAM_LDAP and NSS_LDAP connected to the eDirectory server by way of LDAP using a simple bind in clear text. This means the conversation between the client and the server can be read by anyone or anything that can access the transmission. In order to secure the conversation between the LDAP client, in this case NSS_LDAP and PAM_LDAP, and the LDAP server, in this case eDirectory LDAP, it is necessary to configure both the client and the server to be able to communicate using TLS. TLS uses shared certificates to validate a connection and encrypt the conversation. The client imports a certificate from the server that will be used to validate the tree CA that the LDAP server is using during the connection process. The eDirectory LDAP server by default is configured to use a server certificate and listen on both port 389 and port 636. iManager can be used to determine the certificate being used by the LDAP server and to verify the certificate to ensure it is working and not expired. Log into iManager. Under Roles and Tasks, choose LDAP, then LDAP Options. Under the LDAP Server tab, choose the server being connected to. Under the Connections tab, check the certificate configured. Under Roles and Tasks, choose NetIQ Certificate Access, then Server Certificates. Since there is only one server in this tree, the server certificates are displayed. If there are more servers in the tree, browse to the server where we are configuring LDAP to see certificates. Select the certificate being used by the LDAP server and choose Validate. The certificate status should change from unvalidated to valid. If not, troubleshoot the certificate until a valid certificate is associated with the LDAP server. NDS trace and netstat can be used to ensure LDAP is properly bound for TLS communication. To view all the LDAP communications, make sure all the tracing screen options are enabled either using iManager and modifying the LDAP server object, then enabling all the trace options, or by using the command line utility LDAP config. Type LDAP config set LDAP screen level equals all. Load NDS trace, enable the LDAP tag, then unload an LDAP, and load an LDAP. This will display the startup information for LDAP and if TLS is bound to port 636. From a terminal window, type netstat -nap pipe grep listen. This will show if port 636 is bound by NDSD. In the first part of this series of tutorials, eDirectory LDAP was configured to allow simple binds without TLS. To ensure simple binds to the eDirectory LDAP server use TLS, the setting will be re-enabled. Use iManager, Roles and Tasks, LDAP, LDAP Options, LDAP Group associated with the server, and check the Require TLS for Simple Binds with Password option. Restart NLDAP to make sure all configuration has taken effect. Use NLDAP-U, then NLDAP-L. The client will use an export of the certificate used by the LDAP server to validate the certificate presented by the LDAP server when a connection is established. iManager can be used to export the trusted root of the certificate used by the LDAP server to a base64 format. In iManager, under Roles and Tasks, choose NetIQ Certificate Access, Server Certificates as when validation was performed. This time, choose Export instead of Validate. In the drop-down next to Certificates, select the certificate to export and select the organization CA. Do not export the private key. In the drop-down next to Export Format, select Base64. Choose Next, then click the link to save the export certificate and save the certificate. The client needs to be configured to use the certificate and make TLS connections to the LDAP server. Copy the exported certificate to the SLES server. Place the exported certificate file in the etc SSL certs directory on the SLES server. Run c_rehash to create a hash link to the certificate so that it will be resolvable. Modify the etc ldap.conf file and uncomment the TLS_CA cert dir equal etc SSL certs and SSL start_TLS. Then save the file. Stop NSCD to verify cache isn't being used. Use NDS trace to view the handshake. Since the conversation could be larger than the screen, enable the tracing to the file nds.log. Reset the nds trace.log file. using set NDS trace equals *R. Test resolution using ID Linux user. Look in the ndstrace.log for successful TLS connections being established. Communications between the client and the eDirectory LDAP server are now secure.